Number 1, the first item is staff will present findings from the shade study. Planning Director Christopher Baker and Planner 2 Christian Williams presenting. Hello.
Thank you, Mayor, Council, for the opportunity to have this discussion with you this evening regarding the shade study. In light of our expected council start time at 6 o'clock, I'm just going to turn it over to Christian and thank him for his work in managing this project and the consultant and the excellent work that he did on it that you're about to hear.
All right. Good morning, Mayor, or not good morning. Good evening, Mayor and Council. Tonight we're going to go over the key takeaways from the shade study that was completed last June. We'll recount why the study was initiated, discuss the boundaries of the study, benchmark standards and best practices. We'll discuss the study findings and the results specific to Goodyear, as well as some recommendations for you all to consider. So, Council adopted the FY 2021 strategic plan back in March 26, 2018. And one of the goals listed under Sense of Community was complete a bike and pedestrian study for the shaded paths and sidewalks and identify projects for future capital improvement plans. So in order to accomplish this, you all also funded a bike and pedestrian project study. The city initiated an RFQ, and ultimately we hired Kaufman Studios to create the study, and that study was completed and delivered last June. We focused our resources to capture the greatest portions of the city possible, and we selected focus areas and corridors that represented the entire community as a whole. So we had 10 street corridors that were studied, and we evaluated them for shade coverage along them, and we also looked at 5 focus areas and looked at all public roadways, parks, and parks within that. What you'll notice about the shade study is in the study area is it captures some to-be-developed areas, such as West Goodyear. We also have the Yuma Road corridor, which connects our historic area along the Maricopa Trail to West Goodyear. We have McDowell Road commercial corridor, and also Estrella and Pebble Creek Parkway corridors, which connect several of our neighborhoods to retail and recreational amenities. This area also captures a wide variety of the housing stock in our community. You've got, historic Goodyear, which has a lot of stock from 1940s. You have some Tarrant Canyon trails, which have late 80s and 2000s households and builds. And that helped us really benchmark where we are today compared to where we want to be. So now let's talk about the benchmarks and standards. The Maricopa Associations of Governments, also known as MAG, has pedestrian area policies and design guidelines, and they recommend a 60% comfortable shade percentage coverage for cities in our region. The picture on the left is an image of an existing Goodyear community and a model overlaying the streets and what that might look like if we were to apply additional standards and practices. The United States Forest Service recommends 30% shade coverage for arid regions such as Goodyear and within the U.S. And on the right, you will see an image of trees documented in a Goodyear neighborhood. So now let's pivot to our findings and takeaways. A total of 6,626 trees were documented. 5 shade-producing structures were documented. 3 of those were in the Bullard Wash Park, and 2 of those were on the corner of Estrella Parkway and Van Buren Street. The documented trees and structures were separated into the previously mentioned categories, so we have corridors and focus areas. Both categories are focused on shade coverage of the active transportation facilities, and the average within these shade coverage of the developed bicycle and pedestrian facilities within the 10 focus areas, or 10 corridors and 5 focus areas. So along the corridors, which are primarily the streets, we currently have a 22% shade coverage. And in focus areas, which includes both private lots and developments, we have a 10% shade coverage. The study also breaks these averages down by specific study corridors and focus areas, and I'll highlight a couple of those for you here in a bit. So a major takeaway from the study, which really codified what we hear parks talking about quite often, is the right tree in the right place. That means there is consideration for the spacing availability, the type and size of tree, and its proximity to paths. So considerations for which direction the sun is facing, which side of the sidewalk these trees are on, and which areas are receiving the shade. Essentially, there's some thoughtfulness being placed in regards to the specific environment and condition of those trees. The study also documented shade structures, and one of the main takeaways was that our structures are more artistic and attractive in nature versus shading in nature. You can see that in the example on the top where you have Astoria Parkway and Van Buren, where they're very attractive, but there's little shade being produced. So we might want to look at that moving forward. Here's another example of one of our corridors. This is Citrus Road, and you might see the 11% and wonder what actually is being counted here, because that area is quite undeveloped. So only the developed parts of this corridor were documented, and what this helps determine is if the remaining sections of the corridor are developed in a similar fashion, will achieve 11% shade. However, on every corridor, there's also a most shaded spot. In this picture on the bottom right, you'll see an example of what 50% shade looks like, and MAG would consider that to be a safe designation. So again, on Citrus Road as a whole, the developed areas have 11%, but there's a spot of 50% on that corridor. That makes sense so far? Cool. All right. Here's another example from the report. It's categorized as a contemporary neighborhood, and the shade varies by the type of roadway classification. So meaning arterials, collectors, and local roadways were all examined separately, but they come up with an average. The most shaded area of the city was also identified here in Centera. On the right, you'll see an area that has 88% shade coverage. However, on the left of the picture, you'll see something that's very common throughout our city. In order to get to this area of 88% shade, you must first walk down an unshaded collector pathway for about 1,000 feet before you reach your first tree. So on average, this collector corridor has a shade coverage of 24%, despite having one spot where there's 88% shade coverage. The shading is really just grouped in one area. Another consideration is how many trees it might take in a developed area to increase the shade coverage. Here's an example that the consultants ran in the Encanto and Bullard area. So here between 149th Lane and Bullard Avenue, the shade coverage is 15%. You can see in the image on the left, this is largely due to how the trees are planted very far back from the sidewalk. The chart on the right shows how many trees would be needed and in the right place to increase the shade. So you can see how many trees would be needed to achieve anywhere from 30% shade up to 60% shade. And lastly, when trees are new, they provide little shade. However, a model was run near Virginia and Bullard Wash on how much shade might be produced when the trees are more mature. So you'll see on the left in the back corner, that's Live Goodyear Apartments. And currently this area has a 5% shade coverage. But as those trees age, say in 10 years, they might produce more like 45% shade coverage all on their own. So now let's move into recommendations. Recommendations are going to be broken into 4 branches. I tried to be a little funny there. Glad someone got it. So the branches are regulations, policies, capital improvement projects, and community outreach. They all require different strategies and tools to implement. So the next slide, I'll walk you through each of these branches. That's good. I wish I would have written that down. That's pretty good. Mic drop. So let's discuss regulations. This study was actually very timely since it was completed right before we started our landscape standards update. So we're currently going through this project, and the study will be evaluated in context to this update. So currently landscape standards are housed in various documents, but ultimately they'll all be housed in one place, which is the zoning ordinance, and these will incorporate the various concepts and findings from this study. This will eliminate the cross-confusion and is more customer-focused for finding that needed information. The second branch is policy. On that, we have Tree City. Tree City is a program by the Arbor Day Foundation, and it's geared towards greening communities across the country. It's a great opportunity to celebrate the importance of the urban tree canopy, and we already do a lot with our trees, and we spend a lot of money maintaining our trees, so why not celebrate that? Private neighborhoods. Much of the area covered is dependent on private residents or HOAs to create the shade on their property, or which might be adjacent to our public sidewalks and trails. Grants. There are a lot of grant opportunities out there which could help us increase our shade coverage. And then asset management. We consider a lot of items to be asset management, whether that be traffic signals, roadways. We have a lot of opportunity here to increase how much we're assessing trees as assets. Capital improvement plan. We have a lot of projects that are going to be taking place throughout the community, and some of those are along our active transportation corridors. So there's definitely an opportunity to increase shade as we do capital improvement projects. And our last branch is a strategy to help assist private homeowners, HOAs, and developed areas that the city has little control over. We can work with an education process. So we could work with digital communications in concert with parks to help educate our residents on how they might incorporate some of these best practices that we found. And if they want to re-landscape or add more trees, helping them do that in a more effective manner. So moving forward, we have some high-level goals that we'd like to achieve, as well as some short-term and near-term goals and long-term goals. In short-term, based on the study findings, we can look to incorporate that right tree, right place concept along our sidewalks versus clumping them. So that's another thing, right tree, right place, and instead of clumping them and grouping them, consider spreading them out so that there's tree and shade coverage across the corridor. And then based on the study findings, we also, I mentioned this earlier, but we do a lot with trees already. We might as well celebrate that by becoming a Tree City USA as an option. And then if we move into new CIP projects, we can look at increasing shade producing trees that the public would interface with along the sidewalks. Midterm, as grants arise, we can seek those as opportunities. We can be more aggressive about incorporating tree replacements into our asset management plan. And we can become more proactive working with developers to add more shade and structures as we continue to build out this city. And then as a long-term, and also we can work with communications again to educate our residents. And then lastly, as a long-term, we can look at how to incentivize homeowners and private developers of built centers to add shade along paths. I know I went pretty quickly there, so I'll stop right here and take any questions you have about the information we provided.
Thank you very much. Councilman Pizzillo.
I think getting the shade structures out there is a good thing. The question I have, how does it link with our water conservation program? Because I imagine the more trees you're going to put up, the more water that's going to use, unless you go specifically for those trees that are low water usage, et cetera. So, and again, I know conservation is a big thing. A gallon we save is a gallon we don't have to produce. So
yeah, that's a great question. I definitely skipped over that in the beginning as I was trying to rush a little bit, but the study also supported one of the recommendations formulated by the Water Conservation Committee. They wanted us to develop a comprehensive citywide tree plan focused on mitigating the urban heat island effect, improving water efficiency and outdoor water usage, and providing a strategy for improving the quality of life outdoors and walkability in the city. So I would say in concert with that goal and using that right tree, right place model, that's definitely meeting those goals.
okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Bill?
Christian, are there costs associated with Tree City?
Might have to defer to David's side on that.
I mean, other than just the sticker on the truck, the public works vehicles and the signs that go up, but
Thank you, Mayor. Vice Mayor Stipp. The Tree City designation really doesn't have too much of a cost to it as far as that application process. There's really 4 requirements to it. One is to celebrate an annual Arbor Day ceremony, have a formal tree regulation and guidance by the city and an ordinance. And then there's also the per capita expenditure, and we've done some preliminary investigating into that. It's a minimum of $2, and we see that we're at about the $8 or $9, so I think we already meet that stipulation. And then lastly, there would be a proclamation by the mayor for that Arbor Day ceremony.
okay, thanks.
Brandon?
So if we were to update landscape path standards, so how does that affect, I guess, new businesses and new developers come to the city? They'd have to, I'm sure they'd be required to use certain types of trees, the right tree in the right place, but would it increase the amount of trees that they need to put in at this point? Is that the delta? Would that be different between the two?
So, Mayor, Councilmember Hampton, we are currently in the process, in the early stages of beginning to update our landscape standards, as Christian alluded to. And so we're partnering with our friends in Public Works in order to balance the shade requirements as well as water conservation, back to Councilmember Pizzillo's comments. There will be, and we currently do have a recommended tree list that's based on ADWR standards, but that's going to be further refined. So there's opportunities to increase shade where people walk and maybe not have trees where people don't walk. And so there can be a balancing act, and that will all be vetted and determined through the landscape standard updates that will ultimately be coming back before council, and we'll have some work sessions as that moves forward.
Okay, yeah, because I know that trees can be expensive to developers and businesses as well. I think there was a church that they're asking for like $100 a tree because they had to build to our standards. So, which I think the trees are nice. I think it helps our value of our city. It looks nice, and it helps the shade, the heat island, all the water conservation work that the water conservation team put into as well. So I think it's good to pursue, but I just want to make sure that we're not becoming a forest when we can't be a forest.
So it's about putting the investment where it makes the best benefit for shade and for the residents and everything else, instead of just requiring a whole bunch of trees.
Okay, I like your tree socks too.
Sherry?
Great presentation. Thank you very much. They say that if we planted 1 trillion trees on the earth, that would solve a lot of our global problems. So I think the trees are a great idea, and they provide shade, and they actually do help with water conservation because they, evaporation is less when you shade. So I think there's a give and take there. My question is, a lot of times we have these huge monsoon storms. In our new guidelines, are we going to have some sort of replacement requirement? Because sometimes I've noticed they are either replaced much, much smaller, and are we going to tackle those issues, how those are replaced?
Mayor, Council Member Loretano, the short answer is yes, ma'am.
I like those. That's great.
We will. Because the standards are in so many different locations now, Christian's on that slide, I don't know if you noticed, but there was 3 different documents. So a developer or a customer would have to go really to hunt and peck in 3 documents, and we're going to focus these in the zoning ordinance, and we'll have those ability to rectify and also provide clarity when a tree does go down. There's a difference between maybe potentially a required, and I say potentially emphasized, a required tree, which then could be replaced, and one that maybe somebody just wants to put in of their own desire that may not have to be replaced. So we'll strike those balances as we work on that landscape project.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Laura?
So I was a member of the Water Conservation Committee, and trees was one of our big topics of discussion because people have very strong feelings about trees. Either they think that they're messy, destructive, a nuisance, expensive to maintain, or they are the step to make our environment livable, contribute to the environment, all the things that have been said. And ultimately, we decided we needed to reevaluate the tree standards. And the whole right tree, right place is so critical because I know that even in my neighborhood, the gardeners come through and just prune these things to death, and then they water them. As soon as they grow, they butcher them. And so it's really a very destructive cycle that requires more water. And so when we get the right landscaping in, it will save a lot of water. One of the challenges that I see are like in the HOAs. In my community, when I bought, we were promised tree-lined streets. Well, once the trees started to fall, they were never replaced. And as people are losing trees in their yards in the front, they're never replaced. And so that is always the challenge because it all starts out all good and well to pass the city requirements, and after that, it tends to decline. That Centera example was beautiful of what it looks like with no trees and what it looks like with a lot of trees, and that to me is very, very telling. So finally, I just want to say, when I worked at the City of Phoenix and City Hall, I could look out over Phoenix, and they have an urban forestry division because trees are so important to our well-being and our quality of life. So I'm very supportive of a tree plan.
Well, I like to hug a tree. All right, so I just think that when you drive down Bullard and all the yellow blossoms are out, there isn't a city around. Surprise has got a couple of streets like that. It matches our logo, the sunshine look. It just says Goodyear. And I agree with the pruning of all the bushes. You start out with something like this, and somebody comes out, and the next thing you've got in a square or a round, and all the flowers are gone. So they look old, and they don't look good. So I think the trees are worth it. And so I'm more for that. But I'm also, as you know, grouping in threes sometimes with the tree and two other plants possibly to spread it out a little bit. But I think color is good. And I noticed a surprise now along the highway. They did all the bougainvillea all the way down one whole section. The color is very nice. And it says Arizona, you know. So I think you kind of have a consensus here on this one. Any other questions? No, we appreciate it. Thank you for the presentation. Since we have a regular meeting, I'm going to have you give all the information item and with no further business, and it is 6:01. So can we give them a break or not?
We'll need a few minutes to
Give a
move
10-minute
tables, Mayor.
break. So no further business discussed. This meeting is adjourned, and we'll begin the regular meeting at 6:10.